Welcome to TVBS Meeting Room as we tackle global issues with a view from Taiwan. I'm your host, Wenqi Yu. Today marks the 25th anniversary of Hong Kong's handover to China. President Xi Jinping traveled to Hong Kong, his first trip outside the mainland since the pandemic started 2.5 years ago, to participate in the swearing-in ceremony for Hong Kong's new chief executive, John Lee. In his much-anticipated speech, Xi Jinping strongly defended Hong Kong's one country, two systems, and confirmed Beijing's ultimate authority over Hong Kong. While many do wonder if the so-called two systems still hold true. There's so much to digest, and we're pleased to have Dennis Kwok with us today. Dennis is a former member of Hong Kong's Legislative Council and a founding member of Civic Party, also a fellow of Harvard Kennedy School Ash Center for Democratic Governance and Innovation. Welcome, Dennis.
Thanks for having me. It's a pleasure to be here.
One country, two systems. Do people still believe that's the case in Hong Kong?
No, I don't think so. I think the majority of the Hong Kong people really saw what happened to Hong Kong in the past few years as a complete takeover of Hong Kong by the Beijing authorities. From the changing of the election system, where we used to have some degree of democracy, that has been completely wiped out. And with the national security law in place, that is like the new constitution of Hong Kong, replacing basic human rights protection and basically wiping out the whole of the opposition camp and also the civil society in Hong Kong, which used to be one of the most vibrant in the Asia-Pacific region.
So walk us through why this is happening. You and Johnny Patterson recently published a paper for Harvard Kennedy School's Ash Center, sharing lessons learned in Hong Kong's unfortunately unsuccessful democratic movement, as you just mentioned. It is eye-opening in many ways, even though many of us may have thought we already know what happened in Hong Kong. Can you share with us the lessons learned from the Democrats in Hong Kong?
Now, there are obviously fundamental differences between the situation in Hong Kong and the situation in Taiwan, as you well know, Wenqi, that Taiwan is basically a de facto independent country with its own civil government, with its own army, with its own completely integrated constitutional system. But Hong Kong has been laboring under the one country, two system for 2 decades. And it was beginning to get very, very difficult to get Beijing to honor the original intent of the two system, which is—
And why is that? Why do you think there's that change in terms of Beijing's commitment to two systems?
I think it really comes down to Xi Jinping and also the change in the international status of China. Now, remember, when Hong Kong was transferred back to China in 1997, the number one goal of the People's Republic of China is to get into the WTO. It is to become a respectable or responsible international player, at least in the eyes of the international community. So there was a real pragmatic need on the part of Beijing in the early 2000s to, honor one country, two system, which was laid down by the Sino-British Joint Declaration. It wouldn't do Beijing any good at that time to dishonor an international treaty registered with the United Nations. But that was then. After they gained entry into the WTO in 2001, as the economy grew exponentially in the first 10 years of the 2000, China became much more confident in its own system. And I think the global financial crisis was a game changer in the eyes of a lot of Chinese leaders. They believe that their system is really better than the Western system. They start talking about having confidence in our own system, 在斗其身. And we begin to feel, I began my political career as a legislator in 2012. That's the same year when Xi Jinping took to power as General Secretary. And 2 years later, the State Council came up with the white paper saying that they exercise comprehensive jurisdiction over the whole of Hong Kong's affairs. Now, this is new to Hong Kong, and this is new to one country, two system. They've never mentioned any such thing. But at the time, I feel like, apart from us lawyers protesting against this new concept imposed on Hong Kong, a lot of people, especially the international community and the business community, simply dismissed what is said in the white paper as mere rhetoric.
On that, let's drill down on this. Why do you think the international community dismiss that piece of white paper? Is it not enough media attention, or is it that the international community had a different imagination about Xi Jinping or Beijing when it comes to what China may do, or to Hong Kong or to its own domestic affairs?
That's a great point. I think it's more to the latter. I remember at the time that I led 3,000 lawyers, all dressed in black, walking out, protesting in silence in Central to the quarterfinal appeal. The intention of that march was really for us lawyers to come out and say, this was not what was the guaranteed constitution arrangement for Hong Kong. You guys better wake up to this, because this white paper marks a change in direction for Hong Kong. But as you said, I think a lot of people were, I couldn't put it another way, but they were naive about Xi Jinping's intentions. They thought that he is going to be as pragmatic as the earlier Chinese leaders, that they will understand that if you break this international treaty, this international promise to the Hong Kong people, there will be significant consequences. But Xi Jinping made a calculation, which I think he was right in the short term from his perspective, is that I'm going to do this to Hong Kong, exercise complete control. Essentially, the international community will still stay and do business in Hong Kong. The banks will stay, and we are financially strong enough to withstand any sort of storm that would be caused by this political move. And he was right.
And why do you think, I think that is the puzzle to everyone, right? So it seemed that China was doing well economically. Hong Kong benefited hugely from that financial and economic development of mainland. So why did she want to change that trajectory? Out of what?
For him, our experience is that politics and his view of nationalism trumps any other consideration. I think this is one of the lessons. You asked what are the lessons learned. I think this is one of the key lessons. Not only that, we have to take his words very seriously when he talks about Hong Kong and also Taiwan. I think we need to take his words seriously. Secondly, I think we need to understand that for him, the nationalistic consideration is always the more important one, much more important than the economy. You could see that in his way of handling not just Hong Kong, but how about the COVID zero policy? Yes. That's tanking the economy in China, but he doesn't seem to care, because for him, the nationalism of China, his communist belief and ideology actually is much more important than any of the other considerations. So that is the policy driver. Now, just coming back to Hong Kong a little bit, from the mainland's point of view, at least the mainland state media, Hong Kong's problems were caused by foreign forces. It was instigated by foreign forces led by the United States. That's what they believe in. That's what the narrative that they sell to the Chinese people domestically. And Xi Jinping is saying, look, we're strong now, but the foreign forces that used to subjugate us to colonialism is now back, and they want to contain us. But don't you worry, you've got a strong leader in me, and I'm going to crush these forces. So that's the narrative that he was pushing out.
Yeah, absolutely. Even the speech just, less than 12 hours ago that he delivered at the ceremony, he started again talking about Hong Kong's history, right? How Hong Kong used to be a colony of foreign forces, but now it's back to China. And so the future is even better because it's back. So I think you're definitely right. You've explained it, sort of this mentality of Xi Jinping. There's always this, once China gets strong and confident, we're going to show to the world that no foreign forces or influence can actually intervene in domestic affairs. And of course, Hong Kong is part of the domestic affairs and now goes to Taiwan. What are the other things that Taiwan should pay attention to? Because you actually mentioned, the most interesting part, I think, is Beijing's sort of long-term strategy in sowing divisions in the pro-democracy camp, basically dividing the moderate Democrats and the so-called localists. You also compare the moderate Democrats to today's KMTs in Taiwan. Can you say more about that?
Now, obviously, the analogy is not perfect, but as a moderate Democrat myself, I found it increasingly hard, especially towards the end of my political career, to defend one country, two systems. Something that is obviously failing, something that's obviously not working, but we were not able, as moderate Democrat, to come up with a coherent political strategy to address the concerns that a lot of the Hong Kong people has, especially the young people. You see, from the young people's point of view in Hong Kong, they didn't sign up to this thing. They didn't really believe in one country, two system. Okay, so you tell me it works over the years. I believe in you, but no longer can I trust you because one country, two system is not being honored by Beijing. So what are the alternatives? So the localists, they came up with a much more radical, assertive view of what Hong Kong's position should be. Some advocated even Hong Kong independence, but something that we moderate Democrats were unable to do. Because we have been saying that let's believe in one country, two system, let's make it work for so many years, that we were unable to extract ourselves from that political position. I think KMT in Taiwan is facing the same problem, that China is saying, one country, different interpretations is actually meaning one country, the People's Republic of China, and the one country, two system model that we offer to Hong Kong. This is the deal on the table. Take it or leave it. And the Taiwanese people are saying, we don't want one country, two system. I think the polls are saying that overwhelmingly, they're saying no. But the KMT is somehow unable to address this, the overwhelming sentiment of the Taiwanese people is that we don't want one country, two system. So what are you going to offer us? DPP seems to have a better solution or a much stronger stance than you do. And I feel like, as I said, the analogy is not perfect, but the moderate Democrats were trapped in the same problem for many years because Beijing failed to honor its promise to the Hong Kong people. And that's, I think, one of the political lessons learned.
So it seems like Beijing also made a miscalculation when it comes to Hong Kong then with an eye towards Taiwan because it failed to honor the one country, two systems. What are the other sort of tactics or strategies Beijing has deployed over the years? You mentioned red capital, which is a really interesting concept as well. And also, of course, the United Front's work on infiltration of Hong Kong's media. Can you just sort of address these 2 points?
Yeah, I think it is important to remember Hong Kong real strength lies in its status as the international financial center. But that too has changed over the years. Now, let's roll back to the early 2000s when we resumed sovereignty, when the PRC resumed sovereignty over Hong Kong. Hong Kong was truly an international financial center in the sense that all the international capital from the UK, US, and Europe were the dominant forces at the time in Hong Kong. It is the US investment banks that were doing all the big deals. They were doing all the big IPOs, M&A. The private equity funds were all mainly US dominated. But gradually that changed, especially after 2010. What we see in the statistics is that over 60 to 70% of the major listed companies in Hong Kong are PRC companies. And they are pushing out a lot of the other blue chips out of the composite index. And you see that a lot of the private equity firms, investment banks, the ones who are getting the big deals for the IPOs are the ones who are Chinese run, Chinese owned. And increasingly, they are now the number one in terms of the mover and shakers of Hong Kong's capital markets. So over the years, that has happened. And what people outside of Hong Kong perhaps didn't realize is how dependent we have become on red capital instead of international capital markets. We have depended on finance from the mainland to drive our economy. We've depended on the so-called favorable policies from the mainland that benefited a small percentage of Hong Kong people over the many others. But the small percentage of Hong Kong people are the ones in power, and they have become completely economically reliant on China as an economy, which basically meant that the elites in Hong Kong, those who are in the top business and in the top government level, they are completely subjected to Beijing's. Yeah, they completely subjected themselves to Beijing economically. That left them with very little choice but to just obey Beijing's order. The key difference between the big protests in 2003 and the big protests in 2019 is that in 2003, at least you see the business, the local Hong Kong business coming out to say no to Beijing. No, this is wrong. You shouldn't be doing this. We're not supporting you. And that would basically change the course of the direction in 2003. But in 2019, even though 2 million people came out, none of the Hong Kong local business people were courageous enough or willing to come out and say to Beijing, look, this is the wrong direction. You're just doing this in the wrong way. But that was, I think, one of the key differences between the Hong Kong now and the Hong Kong back then.
So a key question for you. A lot of people, observers in the West in particular, are very worried about Hong Kong's international financial hub status, right, after 2020, and especially the national security law. Do you think that's actually going to change Hong Kong's financial hub status, or by China or Beijing's intentional bringing Hong Kong and integrating it into sort of the mainland economic development system, Hong Kong is actually economically and financially will be fine?
Now, I think you probably read in the news that a lot of the expats in Hong Kong, especially the US banks, the investment funds, are moving the people out of Hong Kong to Singapore or other parts of Asia. You probably read news about that recently. And they say it's because of COVID, because of the hard quarantine measures that Hong Kong still has in place when the rest of the world is opening up. Now, people sometimes fail to make the connection between the hard COVID zero quarantine measures and politics. They think the two are separate. In fact, they're not. Because in the old Hong Kong, when there are still an opposition, when there are still real elections to a certain degree, and also with a free and independent media like Apple Daily and Stan News, the way it works is like this, that we would make, if the government is pursuing unpopular policy, like a hard COVID quarantine policy, we would make a lot of noise in the Legislative Council. The media will embarrass the government every day and come out with stories to show how stupid the government is.
That's democracy.
To a point where even the international business community, like the American Chamber of Commerce, will say to the chief executive, look, you guys are just driving us away. And the turning point is that even the pro-Beijing camp politicians will secretly lobby the government to pull back on unpopular policies, because they would say to the government, look, we're going to get a kicking in the next election if you continue to do this. We can't support you. That was the delicate balance that we had in Hong Kong, even though we didn't have full democracy, but we had accountability. Public opinion still mattered. But now, with the election system completely changed, with no freedom of the media, with no longer that the politicians and officials no longer have to care about the Hong Kong people's opinion, they only had to follow one thing, and they can only follow Beijing's policy. If Beijing say COVID zero hard quarantine is our national policy, Hong Kong has no alternative but to follow it. Now, that's the key difference between the new Hong Kong and the old Hong Kong. So the international business is saying, oh, why are you pursuing this COVID hard quarantine policies, really driving business away? We cannot keep our people here. My manager on the ground in Hong Kong is going crazy with his wife being sent to a concentration camp in Penny Bay. Yeah. So that is the kind of differences we're seeing. And I'm afraid that Hong Kong's economy and most of the important strategic decisions will continue to be driven by domestic political considerations in mainland China, driven by the CCP. That is the key difference. We used to have a high degree of autonomy. Now we've lost it. So everything that you see happening, I think, will be driven by domestic political needs in China.
With that, what is your advice to Taiwan? Maybe to both political parties in Taiwan, mainly the DPP and KMT, as well as perhaps the businesses, because as you know, lots of Taiwanese businesses in China as well, and also to the international community. How do we think about this right now?
I think the one most important lesson learned is that that we were too dependent on the mainland economy. We have lost our ability to harness the international connections of Hong Kong and how we used to.
But did Hong Kong actually have any other alternative, given just how closely linked it is to mainland China? And I think, yes, Taiwan may be able to have a lot more independence when it comes to the economy. But did you think Hong Kong would be able to be more independent?
I think the Hong Kong people were complacent, about the whole situation for far too long. And when we had a choice to go international, when we had a choice to become more integrated to the international system, we didn't take that chance, and we were just too complacent in relying on the mainland economy because it was the easy thing. It was easy. People rely on easy options. So I think my advice to Taiwan is that don't rely on easy options. Think about the question in a more sophisticated, long-term way, in ways that will protect your national security and your national economy. That's number one. Number two is do not let CCP politics or United Front to divide your society, to make it even more polarized. Because what we saw in Hong Kong was the society became very polarized, that it was very easy for CCP to take over Hong Kong because the Hong Kong people were polarized by domestic politics. In many ways that you see, that's happening in Taiwan as well. The polarization of politics between the blue camp and the green camp is making things easy for CCP to infiltrate and also to exercise the United Front network. And most importantly, I think, is that you've got to take Xi Jinping's words seriously. I think this man means what he said when he said that he will not leave the Taiwan question to the next generation. I think we should take it seriously on its face and not just dismiss it as communist rhetoric, as we have learned painfully through the Hong Kong lesson.
Well, thank you. This has been excellent. We have two students from Zhengzhi University graduate school joining us today to ask you some questions. First, we have Cindy Lee. So Cindy.
Okay, good morning, Mr. Guo and dear host Wen-Chi. My name is Cindy. So thank you for having me to have a conversation for this meaningful topic. Based on today's topic, I'm curious about, as we know that the infiltration of the CCP capital in Hong Kong seems to have slowed down the solidarity of foreign capital whenever there is any political incident happening. It dawns about me that the use of important corporate influence, such as the chip industry in Taiwan, for example, TSMC Taijidian, might stimulate the international power to help because of needs. So based on what had happened in Hong Kong over the years, would you suggest that Taiwan should continue to strengthen the high-tech industry in order to increase the international solidarity of foreign enterprises for Taiwan? Thank you.
Oh, I think absolutely, without question, that you should harness the international network and international community as your strength. I think one of the lessons we learned is in Hong Kong that happened too late. We were too complacent in relying on the mainland economy and access to mainland capital, that we became lazy, essentially. We became lazy, and that weakened our internal system. I think Taiwan has a lot going for it, especially as you mentioned, the high-end semiconductor industry is world-class, and do not allow that to go to waste in terms of your international leverage. Because at the end of the day, what China is going to do, what the CCP leadership is going to do, they're going to make a calculation to ask themselves, if we do this to Taiwan, what will the international community do and react? Are they going to be essentially pushed over and accept the reality like they did in Hong Kong? Or are they going to do more in order to protect Taiwan? I think that is the kind of calculations that is going through Beijing right now. They're looking at Ukraine, they're looking at how the West reacted to Ukraine, and they're thinking the same questions over Taiwan.
Well, Asmita.
Good morning, Mr. Kwok and host Wanchi. My name is Asmita and I'm from India. And my question is, in 2019, I was in Beijing on a language program, and right now I'm doing master's in Taiwan. So as a student who has been to these two places in different period of time, I'm curious about, how do you think the situation and the development in Hong Kong, do you think the situation and development in Hong Kong is pushing Taiwan further away from Beijing? Thank you.
I think the election results in 2019 in re-electing President Tsai Ing-wen to the second term, I think that the Taiwanese people have sent a very clear message, is that looking at Hong Kong, we don't want to have anything to do with one country, two system. It's not working. It's not something we want for the future of Taiwan. And that is that's a game changer, because in the past, the situation of the Taiwan Strait have been basically managed through a peaceful ambiguity on both sides. PRC is not insisting that it must reunite with Taiwan, although the rhetoric is there, but there is a kind of flexibility towards the attitude of one China, different interpretations. We can sort of fudge the issue a little bit on the key questions over reunification. And the Taiwanese people has not previously outrightly said through an election that we will not accept one country, two system. That is the key issue, and the Taiwanese people, especially the young people, will not accept it, because this is not what they want. And things have almost come to a head because of that, because this ambiguity that we used to see over the Taiwan Strait is now becoming quite certain on both sides. What I worry about is the narrative that Xi Jinping needs to push forward. But what I mean by his narrative is this, that Mao Zedong founded the People's Republic of China. Deng Xiaoping made it rich. What is his narrative that will justify him to be the lifelong president, which is clearly what he wants to be. He wants to be a lifetime president, but he needs a political legacy in order to achieve that. In the words of Kevin Rudd, Taiwan is the holy grail of CCP politics. It is the only piece of unfinished business left by Mao's revolution. In order for Xi to become that leader that he wants to be, he needs to do something over Taiwan in order to justify and put himself up there with the other great leaders in modern Chinese history. And a divided Taiwan, a divided China doesn't suit his narrative, because his narrative is that he wants to make China strong again. He wants to make China great, the rejuvenation of the Chinese civilization. That is his narrative. And a divided China, or with a Taiwan that is moving further and further away from that narrative, is not going to play well in his domestic political calculations. So at some point, he will be under pressure, even, I would say, to do something over Taiwan. And that is why the world should be very concerned about the peace and stability over the Taiwan Strait.
Well, that gives me chills. But finally, thank you, Dennis, for joining us today. As the world watches celebration in Hong Kong, Taiwan is certainly on people's mind. So thank you so much for helping us learn more about lessons learned in Hong Kong. We wish you the best and take care.